slama vječin, rasti i cvijetaj, zemljo ravnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode,
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 15th of March, 2024, and I come to you tonight with the aforementioned breakdown of the interview given by, or the bizarre interview given by Emmanuel Macron, French president and worst Napoleon impersonator ever. Well, the worst Napoleon impersonator since Joaquin Phoenix, in actual fact. So, we are going to be going through the interview tonight. I have a dubbed version. The translation's not particularly good because the translator's having to do a lot of hard work, both translating Macron and his questioners from French television. So, if you're listening to this on the Patreon version, I hope it comes through clearly on there. I've tried to make the volume as clear as I possibly can. So, before we get to that, though, we'll do the customary greetings in the chat, and we have with us so far Banana Bender, who says good morning, because indeed you are at the other end of the world and inside tomorrow already. Banana Bender adds, there's rumours floating around in the French press that Macron's wife, 24 years his elder, is actually a man. Well, have we got ourselves a French version of the Big Mike situation? Is this what's going on here? This is getting very medieval, to say the least. I mean, remember the rumor that the reason why the Catholics introduced the check on the Pope's genitalia is after the Pope Joan incident? Perhaps we're heading in that direction. Greetings to President Jesus, who joins us from the perpetual dictatorship of Gavin Newsom, and Dr. Ahmed, who joins us from Egypt. Otis, good evening to you. We have Red Star Betty coming to us from Weardale, County Durham, and Jerry joins us from Hampshire, all the way down south there. Potted Rodent comes to us from an undisclosed location, and Peter joins us from Perfidious Albion itself. Hello to Nikolov, who's joined us, and Martin joins us from the other side of the pond, soon to be contested Georgia, I believe, still being contested by Trump. And Davey joins us. Good evening to you. Muzzle Paint, solidarity to you. Ash joins us also from the region of Melbourne, Australia. And we have Matthew with us, and C. Bolt, and Brad Wall. And Thomas, hello to you. Gracie Knoll, hello to you. Steve Choate, hello to you. And Arnold, who says good evening. And Alex Oliveira, who says greetings from Brazil. Good to have you with us from the opposite end of the other side of the pond. And Gracie Knoll says good afternoon from Seattle, Washington State. Is that the same Seattle that a combination of libertarianism and worst ideas of leftism have apparently left ruined, if you believe the memes from people online? Maybe memes aren't accurate, though. Do let us know if they're not. So, okay, we have today a special treat in lunacy for you, because you have the sight of the French president suddenly being confronted with what you might say is the realities of his situation and not handling it particularly well. So we will be getting into the lunacy of Macron and why he looks so completely stupid in this interview. Now it's 30 minutes long. We may cut this after the first 15 minutes or so, because he then just gets into like ridiculous repetitions and sounds even more ridiculous. So if you permit me to place on the ancient headphones, due to the fact that my battery-powered ones aren't charged up. Good evening to Irish Partisan, who has joined us all the way from Minsk. So, I'm going to add this into the mix now.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président.
Vous avez choisi de
Let me know
dans les 20 heures.
if the volume on this isn't particularly good. I'll see what I can do about it. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to go through the first few minutes of this. It's just introductions. And then, as with the Sunak video the other day, when I feel like I know he's telling a clear and obvious lie, I will intervene.
De nos deux chaînes pour clarifier votre position sur notre engagement aux côtés de l'Ukraine. Alors, le
Good evening, President Macron. You've chosen to talk on Ukraine
And after an international conference, you surprised everyone by refusing to exclude to send troops in Ukraine. Then you called Europeans to not be cowardly, and then you said there was no limit, no red line when it came to French support to Kiev. Did we understand this properly? Do you think we will send Western and French troops to Ukraine? Good evening and welcome. You are sitting here in front of me. Are you standing? No.
Est-ce que vous excluez de vous lever à la fin de cette interview?
Do you believe that you will be standing up by the time this interview is over?
Voilà.
Yes, we will actually.
Nous, on n'est pas sûr de le faire, mais en tout cas, on n'est pas dans cette...
Well, we're not sure that we will send troops, but we're not...
What an amazingly clever analogy that he's just made there. Are you sitting down now? Will you be standing up later? Well, I've just proved something. I mean, is that the best thing he could think of? This man clearly thinks of himself as some sort of genius, and that's the best analogy that he could come up with? Seriously.
in the situation yet.
Non, mais d'abord, il y a
Yes,
différents...
but standing up or sitting down is not a matter of life or death. Yes, there's a matter of degrees. I do this comparison to explain what it means to not exclude options,
position qui consiste à
and the position which consists of saying simply what we are doing, giving us red lines. What is the situation?
depuis 10 ans,
For the last 10 years, because this started in 2014, Russia has started a war of aggression against Ukraine. Then
Okay, well, we didn't have to wait long for a clear and obvious lie, because that's a clear and obvious lie. Russia did not start a war of aggression in 2014. The war of aggression began, we know now, was begun by the United States, Britain, and indeed the French. But the United States and Britain and Canada were in the lead role. We know we know now, thanks even to the reporting of the New York Times, that they'd actually been inside Ukraine, that is the CIA and MI6 too, I believe, working with Ukrainian intelligence services and developing their networks there for many, many years. So who made the first move? Well, the first move actually got made way before 2014. The first move was made, as is openly acknowledged in the West, really, in 2004. That was their first move to decisively pull Ukraine into the US orbit. And let's go back even further. Let's go back to 1998, which, if you remember the show we did on the NATO Russia relations in the 90s, which is a few weeks ago now, you'll remember that even during the Yeltsin administration, even during the period of time where Russia was ruled by pure compradors, they were still scheming to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. The first agreements between Georgia, Ukraine, and NATO were signed in 1998. That's how far back this goes, under the supposedly pro-Russian, by the way, Leonid Kushma presidency. And Kushma, of course, the only person he was pro was himself and his bank account. So given that they all knew very well what the moving of NATO's boundary up to the border of the Russian Federation, specifically when dealing with Ukraine, for all of the reasons that has been outlined many times before, was always going to be a problem. They kept saying they weren't going to do it, and also going ahead and doing it, and saying they were engaging with Russia whilst knifing Russia in the back. So again, this started as early as 98, the NATO expansion into Ukraine, which, by the way, Macron, if you recall, going all the way back to the period immediately before the launch of the special military operation, that Macron was assuring Putin, oh, no, there's no question of Ukraine joining NATO. We're not going to allow them to join NATO. But as Putin pointed out in the interview he gave with Carlson a few weeks ago now, they all agreed to the accession talks starting with Georgia and with Ukraine back in 2008, and then said to Putin, oh, yeah, but we don't mean it. So even under the terms that previous French presidents have acknowledged, for instance, Sarkozy flew to Moscow in 2008 to intervene personally in support of a peace deal, as did representatives from the EU. And they basically acknowledged that Georgia wasn't going to join NATO. And indeed, when it came to Georgia, because Saakashvili was overthrown shortly afterwards and removed from power and fled to Ukraine, now he's back in Georgia again, the whole plot revolving around Georgia seems to have stalled. But again, like even under the terms acknowledged by one of his predecessors, he's lying, because the plan with Ukraine started a long time beforehand. The New York Times has revealed that there was CIA operations going on in Ukraine since at least 2014. There were US biolabs operating in Ukraine, I believe, even earlier than that. So this is all a lie. But it's a lie that is the official US imperialist line, and so he's repeating it. So much for that much vaunted French independence.
We did everything to establish peace. The
Lie, obviously, but let's go on.
agreements, the negotiation under French and German supervision with Russia and Ukraine. In this very room, there was the only meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin on the 9th of December 2019.
Okay, so again, lie by the admission of his predecessor now. The Minsk Accords were a farce. They were a farce because, as his predecessor, François Hollande, has stated, they were merely a holding pattern, or a delaying tactic, designed to buy the NATO countries time to build up Ukraine's forces, to reconstitute Ukrainian armed forces that had essentially collapsed in 2014. And as Gennady Zyuganov and others of the leadership of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation have pointed out, had there been a military intervention against the Ukrainian forces in 2014, that Ukrainian regime would have completely disintegrated. The Maidan regime, the Maidan coup regime, would not have lasted if there had been a strong Russian military intervention, even just to protect Donbass in 2014. But they didn't. They didn't do that. Hollande and Merkel, as representatives of the European customer base for Russian oil and gas, flew to Moscow and prevailed upon Putin to sign various deals not to intervene any further than Crimea. So this is the reality here, is that the 2014 and the Minsk I and Minsk II were, by the admission of Merkel and Hollande, deals that were never meant to be taken seriously. So again, Macron is full of shit, even by the admission of his predecessor.
And Russia, the regime of the Kremlin has decided on its own in February 2022 to launch the second step of this offensive, which is an all-out war against Ukraine, and not only...
It's not an all-out war. And you can tell it's not an all-out war because even in cities that they have fought over, they've actively avoided targeting civilian areas. They've allowed comprehensive evacuations. They've allowed corridors for civilians to leave in either direction. It was the Ukrainian, really NATO forces that were blocking that. And that's allowed a situation where there's been minimal levels of civilian casualties. If you want to look at an all-out war, Emmanuel, I suggest you look at Gaza. That's an all-out war. That's an all-out genocidal war being waged. So what the Russians are doing is still a constrained operation. They haven't leveled Kiev, despite the fact that many of the rather more hot-tempered individuals inside the Russian political structure would have done so. You know, so there's plenty of people who wanted to level all of Ukraine, and the Russian government so far, I think rather sensibly, has not done that. So again, it's not all-out war. What the Israelis are doing, that's all-out war. What the US did to Iraq is all-out war. So again, man blabbering murd.
the Donbass, because that's not the limit. They often bombard Kiev, they attack Odessa, etc. We have one goal. Russia cannot and must not win this war. For the last 2 years, we've been helping Ukraine, and if things were to slip, it would once more only be the responsibility of Russia. This means that if we decide to be weak today, if in the face of someone who has no limits, someone who's...
Right, clearly Putin has limits. Clearly, I mean, he's having to abandon them as time goes on, but clearly the ones who have no limits are, well, consistently show that they have no limits, as Macron will go on to admit, are the NATO countries. Now, again, like the special military operation, I will repeat what has been said before, was designed, the balance of forces was designed there to really shock the Kiev regime to the negotiating table, to force Zelensky to sign a treaty basically saying that we acknowledge that we've lost Crimea forever, and that the two republics, Donetsk and Lugansk, would be essentially given the Georgia solution, which is for South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which is that they become independent in all but name. This is not acknowledged by the West, of course, but it is tacitly acknowledged by the Tbilisi government, and this is roughly what was on the table and what was agreed to by Zelensky until, of course, the intervention of, well, the US imperialists with Boris Johnson as their errand boy. So again, it's clear that Putin always had limits. The Russian government always imposed limits upon the special military operation. It's the NATO countries that consistently broke those limits.
Gone beyond all of the limits that we imposed. If we naively say, I won't do this, I will never cross this line or another, in that case, you don't decide on peace, you already decide on defeat. And you've decided to say that. Yes, yes. And I accept that. It's the role of the French president in our institutions to say this sort of thing. The French president is in charge of national defense. He decides for the safety of the country what is at stake in Ukraine. An existential war for Europe and for France. I hope we'll come back to that because it's a key topic.
And we will come back to that because he keeps describing it as existential, but he of course doesn't tell you the reason why. And again, he says it's important, and it is. So we're going to come back to his reasoning later, but keep that in mind. He will keep saying it's existential, but then he'll keep lying about why it is. He'll keep saying things like, oh, Putin will go all the way to Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. He knows that that's not true, but on one level, he is telling the truth. It is existential. But again, he's not telling the truth as to why it is.
So I decide, because after 2 years of war, and I'd just like to remind you that we systematically did what we said we wouldn't do, which really changes the way you should hear at what other Europeans are saying. 2 years ago, we were saying we'll never send tanks, and we did it. 2 years ago, we said we'll never send missiles, and we did it. We said we'll never send planes, and some people are sending planes now. So we've put too many limits in our vocabulary.
Right, he's just completely contradicted himself. He was saying a minute ago that, oh, Putin has no limits. And he's just said, it turns out that none of our limits were real. So he's just completely contradicted himself. And he does this quite a lot, of course. Macron often contradicts himself within the same sentence, often in the same paragraph as well. So, like, he's just admitted that, like, there are no limits been put in place so far. But we are about to find out what his real limit is in a minute.
This is not an escalation. We're not at war with Russia. However, we have to be clear. We cannot let Russia win.
So they can't let Russia win, but they're not at war with Russia. Make sense of that one.
But the French don't understand your vocabulary. They don't understand under which conditions French soldiers could go fight in Ukraine. Is it...
Well, they're already there. as we have discussed previously. They're already there and have been killed in significant numbers. They were killed in significant numbers just a few weeks ago. And they've been, of course, actively carrying out operations against the Russians, either through directing Ukrainian attacks or participating in them. That's why the Russians blew up that building with all those French mercenaries in them, in it. So, like, the French forces are already there. He's just done what the British and the Canadians and the Americans have done, which is that they've formally left the service of the French army or the French armed forces and are there supposedly as independent contractors. But these are French soldiers by any other name. So all that would be different, really, if they directly sent French troops in there, it would be that it would be a slightly more honest situation. Right at the moment, they're relying on this sort of plausible deniability, pretending that they're not involved, pretending that they're not fighting a war with Russia, pretending that they're not risking an escalation. Now, what they're desperate to do is, of course, the reason why they invested so heavily in this was because they believed that they could secure a regime change in Moscow via a war that would be effectively outsourced. That's what they hoped for. An outsourced war that would see Ukrainians die in large numbers, dumped in unmarked graves quite a lot of the time, but wouldn't matter because it would this and the sanctions would trigger the regime change they were looking for. They didn't ever think that the Ukrainians could actually properly defeat the Russians on the battlefield. What they hoped for was to bog the Russian army down, inflict significant casualties upon it, to enable a destabilization of the Russian government via a combination of the sanctions plus whatever color revolution type assets they had in place in Moscow and St. Petersburg especially. That's what they were hoping for. They didn't get that. So this is the reality of this operation. It was always a cynical exercise in sacrificing gigantic numbers of Ukrainians in order that they could secure a regime change in Moscow. And it hasn't worked. And now this is why he's looking stupid and tying himself up in verbal knots.
Because the Russian army would break the Ukrainian front line? Is it in the case that a key city like Odessa would fall? You were not precise, but yes, but maybe I was right to not be precise. But the two conditions I've just talked about.
Do you hear that? I was right to not be precise. You see, this is what the NAFO trolls online will claim is strategic genius by obfuscating, contradicting yourself repeatedly and looking stupid. You're actually playing a very devilish psychological game. That Putin won't know what's hit him.
Are they science fiction or is it a possibility? For the last few years, we've been living in a world where what we thought unthinkable is actually happening. This is the end of this naivete that I talked about a few years ago. We have war in Europe. Between Strasbourg and Lviv, there's less than 1,500 kilometers. Can you imagine? War is in this country, so it's not a...
There was war in Europe before. I mean, I know Emmanuel Macron isn't that old. I mean, he's in his, what, late 40s, early 50s? He may recall a certain period in the 90s where there was a little bit of a war in Europe in a place that used to be called Yugoslavia. It's funny how all those wars, both the war in Croatia, Bosnia, then Kosovo, all get sort of written out. They didn't count anymore. It's funny how they always want to forget those.
Fiction, and it's not far away. What happened? So all of these options are possible. The only person who will be responsible for that is the regime of Russia.
Does he think that we're only 1,500 miles from, Lvov to Strasbourg, apparently? Does he think is that like his equivalent of Reagan saying that the Nicaraguans are only 2 days' drive from the Texas border? Because it's not the zinger he thinks it is.
Never will we start an offensive war. We will never take that initiative.
They've already started an offensive war. They started an offensive war in 2014. I mean, what else is the setting up of CIA stations in Ukraine that are there specifically to carry out undercover operations? Again, according to a piece in the New York Times, inside Crimea against the people of Donbass. Donbass, and possibly inside Russia proper. So what is that other than offensive operations? Well, you might want to take it back even further. What is it except of an offensive operation if, say, the MI6 and the CIA were engaged in the business of arming and funding terrorist organizations in the Southern Caucasus, such as, Chechnya? So what is that other than an offensive operation? So they've been carrying out, in actual fact, as Putin often says, and accurately so, offensive operations against Russia in reality since the breakup of the Soviet Union. Since '94, again, even with the Comprador Yeltsin in charge, they were still carrying out offensive operations against Russia. So again, does Macron know that? Well, maybe. He certainly should know that. Putin said it enough times. So again, he's talking complete shit. He's relying upon his audience not knowing what the fuck he's talking about. He's relying on the ignorance of the viewers.
Force for peace. However, today, to have peace in Ukraine, you mustn't be weak. And so we have to look at the situation and we have to be determined. We have to be brave. We have to put the resources necessary to make sure that the Russians don't win. So we're preparing ourselves, we're training for operations, airstrikes.
Au sol.
La France n'a pas
Boots on the ground? Well, France has not waited February 2022 to start preparing.
un modèle d'armée complet
We have a full
et des armées opérationnelles.
army.
Et
We have a deterrence force and we have an operational army. I'd like to remind you once more to honor our soldiers and their families. We are one of the few countries in Europe
pendant 10 ans a eu
that for the last 10 years has had troops deployed in Sahel to fight terrorism.
Okay, well, interesting change of pace there, but let's just deal with this. If those troops were in formerly in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, if they were there to fight terrorism, they did a shit job of it, because there ended up being, surprisingly enough, more jihadists in all of those countries after the French military deployments than there were before it. Now, so either the French army is completely incompetent and completely unable to actually combat these apparently mysteriously multiplying jihadists, or, and this is the alternative idea that I want to present to you, they weren't there to fight the jihadists at all. They were there to essentially maintain, as he goes on to admit in just a moment, French military outposts and also French commercial interests. But what were they actually there to do? What were they actually doing with the jihadists, given that they proved incapable of defeating them on the battlefield? Well, my speculation, and I think this is something that is backed up by the developments that have occurred in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, what happened was that the French were happy to see, at the very least, the growth of these jihadist organizations, and used the cover of the so-called war on terror to insert more forces into these areas to make sure that this situation of perpetual civil war continued. I mean, this is a classic colonial tactic. I mean, the British certainly have done this over and over again. The US has done this over and over again. They did this in Iraq. Which is that you create a long-running civil war, or you create a situation of massive divisions in the country, but you help to fuel this jihadist, Salafist insurgency. You then insert your army in there and say that you're there to fight terror or you're there to keep the peace. But in actual fact, what you're there to do is to make sure the country remains perpetually unstable with very weak governments that you can control via the fact that you've got significant military assets on the ground. And of course, you then keep control of the vital resources of a country like Niger, which you've been successfully controlling for many, many years. And you get to delay again any attempt that government might take, that state might take, to fully express its independence, given that they only got flag independence, as it is called, back in the 1960s and have been a neo-colony ever since. This so-called war on terror was nothing of the kind. It was the French, not just them, but many other countries in the Western imperialist bloc, using this as a cover to maintain their hold over those countries in the Sahel. That's why they were there. It's nothing to do with fighting terrorism and everything to do with making sure that those jihadist groups were kept in play and that insurgency never ended. And therefore you had a perpetual justification for always having troops in those regions and dominating the economic life of those countries as a result, and continuing to extract vast amounts of resources from them, and the government being too weak and too disempowered to do anything about it. That's what it was all about. As Movie Murky Joe says in the comments, the Malian president said in August 2021 that France was arming terrorists. There's an Al Jazeera article on it. Yeah, I mean, it's fairly obvious by now what this was all about. There's a reason why the imperialist politicians like Tony Blair keep talking about the Sahel as being crucial. It's because they're the ones who, they know it's crucial for all the resources it's got in it. So good way to always secure an intervention, fund a terrorist group, arm a terrorist group. It's what they've been doing for years. And isn't it funny how ISIS franchises keep popping up in places like Mozambique, which had very little history of this kind of thing going on? So this is the same bullshit that you always get from these imperialist politicians, but always bear in mind, one of the biggest frauds in recent decades has been this whole war on terror concept. It's a complete fiction. The people in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic and other places know it's bullshit. They know it was neo-colonialism in a new phase, but with new advertising. Those who fell for the bullshit were, of course, people in our countries, people in the imperial core.
And we've lost dozens of people there. Yes, but it wasn't the same type of battle. Yes, but we were fighting Islamists we were fighting terrorists.
He means employing terrorists, just to be clear.
So we were fighting domestic terrorists to prevent the sovereign state from collapsing and to protect our outposts. But do we believe? So we don't have to do that now in Ukraine, but does that mean we should exclude the possibility of doing it? What I've said is that we're ready, and I've decided at the start of my new term as French president, I've decided to make sure that we double the budget of the military. So we're not simply waking up today. I just want to clarify a point, which is that what's happened these past few months is a deep, deep change. And what I asked on the 16th of February with Zelensky, what led me to say what I said, and to decide on very hands-on steps with our allies. What decided all this is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive didn't go as planned, and the
Nice acknowledgement now, Emmanuel. The Ukrainian counteroffensive did not go as planned. I think that's the understatement of the decade so far, given that the Ukrainian counteroffensive led to a gigantic amount of casualties, the loss of almost all the Western military equipment that was provided for it. And what did they win? Like 2 villages? Was that it? And it was a complete disaster from start to finish. And by the way, everybody could have told them that it was a disaster, and it was a brewing disaster, because they essentially advertised their offensive for 6 months in advance. What kind of military operation is it that you start advertising it in the US Congress in December of 2022, and then you carry on advertising it, even doing a trailer for it, and then think that what's going to happen, that you send your armored columns against a deeply entrenched, very well dug in Russian army, which even military experts who work for the armed forces of the United States, Britain and France acknowledge that defensive warfare is a traditional strength of Russian, Soviet and old Tsarist armies. And you're going to send a force without significant air cover against a heavily entrenched Russian force that has had months and months where you've told them exactly where you are going to go, and they've had months to prepare for this coming offensive. And you thought, what did you think was going to happen exactly? Did the Russians were just going to see the Leopard tanks and turn around and shit themselves and run away? No, that didn't happen. There is one other possibility, of course. The that they were more aware of the Prigozhin mutiny that was supposedly coming up, and that they were thinking that, well, if we combine the Ukrainian assault with the Prigozhin mutiny, then there'll be enough destabilization that the Putin regime will collapse. Again, the Prigozhin mutiny was a catastrophic failure. It collapsed inside a day. Almost nobody even joined it, other than like a minority of the Wagner troops, and most of them abandoned without firing many shots. Some Russian Air Force personnel were killed, of course. And Prigozhin, of course, ended up a dead man, killed by, well, take your pick of the long list of enemies. So perhaps they at least knew that the Prigozhin thing was going to happen. Certainly he wasn't hiding his intentions. And that they thought that they could work an angle on that. But again, like the whole thing was based on the idea that the Russians are so brittle they would collapse. And you cannot help but think of the diary entries of Goebbels when looking at the Soviet Union, which was that when Goebbels wrote in his diary after about a month into the fighting, a month into Operation Barbarossa, that, it turns out the Soviets were a lot better organized and a lot stronger and more rooted in the population than we thought, because it turns out that the Nazis had been telling themselves a whole load of mythology about the Soviet Union before Operation Barbarossa began in 1941. Hitler coined the phrase, if you kick the door in, the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down. There is one interpretation of this, that Hitler was actually basing a lot of his projections on the works of Trotsky, who kept saying all the way through the 1930s that even with the achievements of the industrialization period, the Soviet Union is rotten. The Stalin dictatorship has no support amongst the working class. A good kick will knock it over. Apparently, Hitler used to read all this stuff and was very convinced by it. He was convinced that Trotsky had some internal knowledge that would be of benefit to the Nazis. That's according to some sources on this, and you can certainly see why the Nazis would be interested in Trotsky's ravings. Certainly told them what they wanted to hear. But again, like they've made exactly the same mistake, and of course it's the Ukrainians themselves that are overwhelmingly paying for this. And Thomas's point is correct. The traditional thing that we're taught in Britain is that it was the Soviet winter, the Russian winter, that killed off the Nazi offensive. That isn't true. The Nazis had already run out of juice for their offensive by the time they got to Moscow. They were already struggling to resupply themselves. They were losing large amounts of men and machinery. The Russian winter made it worse, but in actual fact, it was the strength of the Soviet political base, the strength of the party within the working class, the strength of feeling of the working class behind the Soviet state, knowing that it was their state, and also the level of industrial development in the Soviet Union, which again Goebbels admits in his diary entries, that they vastly underestimated the capacity of the Soviet Union to produce war material. Again, a mistake that these idiots have also made.
Situation these last few weeks has been difficult for the Ukrainians. It's a very difficult situation, but they have limits. They have limits in terms of troops, because Russia is a larger country. And
no shit, Emmanuel. Did you finally look at a map? Fucking hell.
once there are only Ukrainian
See, that's the kind of genius observation that a private education can buy you in France.
men, they have this limit. There's also a limit in terms of shells, in terms of missiles, because as I'm speaking, when Russia shoots 10 shells, we shoot 1 shell back. So you can see that this creates a situation on the front line which is very fragile. And the Russian regime has gone on a much harder political line these past few months.
And why is that, Emmanuel? Why has the Russian political line hardened over the last year? Well, that's 2 years now. Why was that? Could it be that the actual last chance that you lot had of preserving the comprador elements within the Russian state that did used to be there right up until February and March of 2022? Remember, Anatoly Chubais, this wretched leader of the comprador faction, was still in the Russian government right up until 2022. He was in a non-job. He was the climate change envoy, which is basically a license to travel around talking shit and run up expenses. But he was still there as the leader of the comprador group. So he was like the last expression, him and Navalny, of the comprador tendencies. Chubais in the government, Navalny outside of it. And the last elements of support that the sort of pro-US, pro-European types had in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that's all gone though. These people are all completely discredited. And Macron and his allies in the US and Britain were the ones who actually killed off their own support network, because the political line of Russia hardening was what many Russians, including both the communists and the nationalists, have been calling for decades now, and had a degree of success because their words, particularly the words of the KPRF, kept coming true, that there could be no deal with the imperialists that would ever be respected. And this is indeed what turned out to be the case. And as KPRF's predictions kept coming true, Putin kept adopting more and more of their program, until eventually, of course, he was forced to come out fully and actually start telling the full truth to the Russian population. He'd been telling versions of it for years, but he's become a lot more open about what has gone on in terms of the con artistry of the US imperialist bloc. And this is what Macron sees as a hardening of the political line. Well, yeah, no shit. This is exactly what you get. Finally, you pushed the Russian government to the point where it had to take a clear and coherent anti-imperialist stance. It had to actually come out and fight you. And this is something that you thought was going to be a winner for you, and it's turned out to be a disaster. Because again, you didn't do basic intelligence work. You didn't actually bother to interrogate what the actual reality of the Russian economy and political structure was. You created a fantasy version for yourselves that was based apparently on like some scant knowledge of Russia in the 1990s, but you never bothered to seriously interrogate what roots of support the Putin government had inside Russia, but also what was the strength of Russian national feeling against you, Emmanuel, against the US, against what's termed the collective West, or what I term the US imperialist bloc. Turns out that strength of older national feeling that has a lot to do with the former Soviet Union was what, of course, powered the working class rebellions in Donbass. And you didn't understand that. And you didn't understand the fact that the Russian population rallied around the government when it started to actually fight people like you. And so you haven't understood this at any point. You created a complete fantasy version of both Russia and Putin and everything else to do with this war. And then you tried to conduct the war with the fantasy version that you had created. And surprisingly enough, it didn't work.
They've increased cyber and informational attacks in our daily lives on hospitals in France and in Europe.
Is there any evidence of that? What, that the Russians are doing cyber attacks on hospitals? I mean, this is a new one on me. Maybe if anybody's watching this who has knowledge of French affairs, you can comment on it. But I've not heard of this at all. Every time there's a supposed cyber attack in the United States or Britain, they say, oh, Russian hackers are behind it. There's no evidence of any of this at all. Usually what happens when there's a hack into something isn't that there's a long distance hacking job like this is Simon Pegg in a Mission Impossible movie in his role as the tech geek. It's usually that somebody's got a password which is just simply password, and somebody's worked it out or bribed or blackmailed their way to get hold of a password and get in that way. I mean, that's what's usually the case. But this idea that there's this vast Russian hacking operation, hacking into hospitals, what evidence is there of that? It's an assertion that he's making.
en décidant de tuer des opposants
They've
politiques.
decided to kill political opponents. Yes, but this isn't new.
Mais je ne dis pas que c'est nouveau.
I'm not saying it's new. I'm saying it's like intensifying.
C'est ce que je veux dire.
Yes, but
There's no evidence that they killed Navalny, by the way. My theory on Navalny is still that the British killed him because he outlived his usefulness and they needed a big headline for the Munich Security Conference. So Navalny's at the end of his lifespan. Terminate him, blame the Russians, get yourself a round of applause at the Munich Security Conference. That's what's probably happened.
shouldn't the alarm bells have rung sooner?
Tout à la fois me reprocher de la sonner trop
You
tôt
can't
et d'avoir
tell
fait la sonner
me
plus tôt.
both that I'm ringing the alarm bell too early and that I should have rang it earlier.
Au-delà de sonner
We
l'alarme, pour
did
être exigeant.
everything
Des
beyond
accords
ringing
avec
the alarm bells to be demanding,
La lucidité que j'évoque devant vous,
but
je
what I'm
l'apporte
saying
dès le
is that
mois
the
de juin
clarity
2017.
that I have with Putin started in 2017 in Versailles,
Vous
saying,
manipulez nos données, j'en ai été victime dans ma
you attack us, you manipulate our data, I was a victim of that, so we have to have a form of mutual respect and you have to stop being a force for
Nous
destabilization.
voulions éviter la guerre. Puis
Again, this is this is simple coded confession territory here. The Russians are a force for destabilization. Well, again, we know that the opposite is the case. Let's go back and look at the New York Times article published recently. The CIA and MI6 are running destabilization operations in Ukraine for decades and decades, not just since 2014, not just since 2004, all the way back to the early 1990s. They've been running destabilization operations inside Chechnya. They've been running destabilization operations in Georgia. They've been encouraging the most fascistic elements in the Baltic states. They've done all of this, and they've tried to encourage further developments to move against Russia in Central Asia, largely unsuccessfully, it must be said. So again, who's the destabilizing influence here? It's you, Emmanuel. It is you and Biden and Johnson and, well, Sunak and who the state machines of the imperialist countries. That's who the destabilizing agents are. This is ridiculous. I mean, even for him, this is ridiculous.
At the time, we wanted to avoid war. Then we wanted to help Ukraine to resist. Now the context on the Ukrainian front is changing.
la Russie durcit chez elle et elle
Russia is changing at home and it's multiplying its attacks. So yes, I'm telling this
début d'année
to you
2024.
very clearly. At the start of 2024, we need to wake up. So if we send soldiers,
C'est des conseillers.
is it infantrymen? Is it advisors?
Non,
Let's not talk about that.
Let's not talk about that. You've spent the last 2 weeks talking about that. Wasn't that what meant to be what this interview was about? Should we send soldiers or advisors? Let's not talk about the thing that I've been talking about constantly for the last 2 weeks, or dropping very strong hints at. Okay, so it turns out Emmanuel did get Putin's message.
d'abord, je ne le souhaite
We
pas.
have to keep it in mind, but we shouldn't talk about it. Well, no, I don't want it to happen. I would like for Russia to stop this war and to retreat from its positions.
Ce qui est important,
Yes, but you don't believe that will happen.
ça n'est pas mon souhait. Mais
What's important
donner de la visibilité à
is
quelqu'un qui ne m'en donne pas.
it's not what I want, but I shouldn't give visibility to someone who's not giving me any. You should ask President Putin where his red lines are. Yes, but your Ministry of the Military has given some visibility. He said we're not sending troops there. Yes, because he distinguished what we were implementing from what we need to do in case we need to adapt. We decided on the 26th of February in Paris that we should go further in assistance to Ukraine, create a coalition to supply them missiles and bombs that will allow them to hit Russian targets in Ukraine, not in Russia.
Well, that's not true. I mean, they've been using Western assistance to target places in Russia for quite some time now. And everybody knows that. I mean, they've been using the Scalp missiles and the Storm Shadow missiles to go after targets in inside Crimea, certainly, which is, of course, not officially recognized as a Russian territory, but is certainly regarded by the Russians as such. So again, like it's another deception here.
We've decided as well to accelerate. We've decided to go look for ammunition everywhere where it's available. That's what I did in Prague as well.
So he's admitting there that, and he goes on to talk about this some more later, that essentially the great European plan for the acquisition of weapons and ammunition hasn't worked, and therefore they're having to run around the world scrounging for this shit. And so clearly the idea that they were going to bring their military-industrial complexes up to war production levels hasn't worked and will not work, because again, all of these are run on a purely capitalist basis, and so therefore they are faced with the same problem that I've talked about before, which is that the British faced it all the way back in 1939 to 40, which is that their capitalist class didn't want to produce the war material required in the requisite amounts that were needed. And they didn't do that because, again, there wasn't enough profitability in it for them. So in the end, even the British capitalists had to be essentially disempowered for the duration of the war. And so now they are still trying to run this outsourced war in Ukraine, and they keep talking this big talk, but so far, no big action when it comes to actually radically altering their military-industrial complex's management structures. Of course, the Russian military-industrial complex is run in a mixed way. There's private elements to it, but it's all state-directed, meaning that private firms can be involved in this, make money from it, but also that they are obliged to produce certain things no matter what, basically. And if you don't produce it, then you're out. That doesn't happen in Britain. It certainly doesn't happen in the United States. So the military-industrial complexes of France, of Germany, and what's left of the Czech Republic are certainly not capable of matching Russian production levels, and he knows it. So he's desperately papering over cracks in this interview.
And we decided to launch 5 common actions, and we all agreed around this table, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, British. We've decided to clear the minefields, produce and repair equipment, deploy civilian forces at the border with Belarus, protect the border with Moldova, and have also defensive actions for cyber attacks on the Ukrainian ground. But you haven't. But they decided not to send troops, and they were very clear as soon as you said that. Yes, but we can come back to that. Yes, but that's the core of the issue. And yes, they're right, but that's what we've decided today, and that's a change. We decided that in Paris, and it's the start of this change. We will do what is necessary to reach our goal, because if Russia would win, the life of the French people would change. How? We will have no more security in Europe anymore. Who can think for 1 second that President Putin, who has respected none of these limits and none of his commitments, who can believe that he will stop?
Well, I can believe it, certainly, because and this is where we get to Macron just talking pure shit again, because he is insisting here in the same way that the British government has said, in the same way that you get Annalena Baerbock saying that, oh, Putin won't stop here, he'll go to the Baltics, he'll go to Poland. Why? He has absolutely no desire, and has said so over and over and over again, to go to Poland. Why on earth would he want to go to Poland? What possible reason would there be for that? What, to re-establish the claims of the Tsarist Empire over the parts of Poland that used to be occupied? No, that doesn't make any sense. Why on earth would he want to trouble himself with the Baltics? Again, unless they launch a crazy attack on Russian territory, or they're trying to invade Kaliningrad, which there's no guarantee they would even win there. What do you see Macron basing this on? It's bullshit. He knows it's bullshit. He's just trying to essentially frighten people with the idea of the rampaging Russian bear ranging across Europe. So what does he actually mean in that French security would be threatened? And here we get to, I think, the real crux of what is going on. And I think here, well, I'll just play a little bit more of this because I think this is the last bit where he really says anything of value. I'm going to call it quits after this because this is getting ridiculous.
So what's going on in Ukraine today is part of France's vital interests. The security of Europe and the security of the French people is at stake there. And those are our vital interests. So you are using words that mean something specific. I'm talking about security. Yes, but you said it was an existential threat. Yes, I did. We've already suffered the consequences of this war. We've suffered these attacks. In several of our hospitals, we've had days of malfunctions because of this Russian aggression. We've had consequences in Europe, the price of gas, the situation of our economy, the cost of wheat.
Yeah, you've had consequences of sanctions you imposed. Like the price of gas goes through the roof. Well, this is only partly down to the sanctions on Russian oil and gas. Partly it's, of course, good old-fashioned price gouging that is going on. But also, like, then goes on about the price of wheat. Well, you've sanctioned all these Russian agricultural products. And so again, like the price of wheat goes up, well, that's directly attributable to the sanctions regime. And you won't relax the sanctions regime. The Russians offered over and over again to supply more wheat if it could be, if the sanctions on Russian wheat would be eased. You've always refused to do that. So when it comes to question over energy prices, when it comes to questions over wheat prices, this is all down to or largely down to the policies pursued by Macron, which is the sanctioned regime. So he's saying, well, there's consequences. Yeah, consequences you created. These weren't created by Moscow. The Russians were happy just to keep selling wheat and oil and gas, and you put the sanctions on. You caused the prices to rise, or you played a large part in causing the prices to rise, and you refuse to do anything to control the price rises put in place by French corporations, just as the British government refuses to do anything to put in place controls over the prices of gas, even though the wholesale price in Britain has gone down. So again, these are all problems he has created, and he's trying to fool people into thinking this is a problem that's been created by Moscow. No, it's a problem that's been created by London, Paris, Washington, and Berlin, and Rome. Let's not forget Rome in all this.
Economic imbalances are consequences of this war that Russia started. And if Russia wins this war, the credibility of Europe will be reduced to nothing. What would be the credibility of the EU if we let this happen? The safety of Europeans, what would be left of it? Do you believe that the Polish, the Baltic countries, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, do you think they'll be at peace?
Well, Putin's also going to invade Bulgaria and Romania. I mean, how's he going to do this with an army, an industrial base, and a population that's like half of what the Soviet Union had? Like, this doesn't make any sense. Macron also knows it doesn't make any sense. He's talking shit. So that's about as interesting as this interview gets. So I'm gonna pull this now. That's quite enough of him. You know, it's complete drivel, but where he says that it's existential, this is something that we should pay attention to, because here we have to deconstruct what he has said. In that he says it is existential, and in that he is actually correct in some respects, because it's existential in the sense that everybody is seeing, and the events in the Sahel prove this, just how enfeebled and weak certainly the so-called European powers are. That's what he means. That if it's not that Putin is going to roll into Bucharest and roll into Sofia and roll into Vilnius, not that, you know, if he took the Baltic states, I think the idea that NATO is going to come and defend them is rather shaky at best. But they're not going to do that unless the Baltic states do something, and Poland do something really stupid, like trying to attack Kaliningrad. And I don't think they're going to do that. So it's not about Putin, going to Lvov and then going on a mad dash to Strasbourg or something like that. It's about the fact that if the Russians win this war, are seen by the term it however you want, the global majority, let's use that term, are seen by the global majority to have won this war, to have defeated the outsourced army of the French, the Germans, the Italians, and the British, and the United States, of course, to have beaten them and to have emerged from it with a much stronger industrial base and a much stronger, in all honesty, a stronger political system at the end of it than they had at the beginning, with the comprador element purged out of it, then he's right in a way in what he says, which is that there will be no more security for Europe. But again, think of what I said when we were talking about Rishi Sunak. When he talks about we and us, he's trying to project onto you, the working class of Europe, his class and his class interests. And this is, again, a classic tactic of bourgeois politicians. What he means when he says there will be no more security for Europe, what he means really is that first of all, that the European project, the EU, is fucked. It's over. Because, again, everybody will see, the global majority will see, that this thing is just an impotent mess and it is finished. There's an argument to say it's been a walking corpse since 2008 anyway, which is that its single currency experiment lasted a glorious 8 years after its launch, and then started to implode in a series of sovereign debt crises. And these debt crises involving Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy to a large degree have never really been resolved. And of course, to get out of to buy themselves time to try and find a way out of this, they, with the collaboration of the Greek ruling class, ruined Greece and launched a vicious class war on the Greek working class, as they have done in many other countries as well, to preserve the credibility of the euro. Because the appearance of Greeks paying off these debts had to be preserved, and therefore Greece had to be ruined, according to the interests of German and French imperialism. So what Macron is meaning is that if the EU is seen to be very much a paper tiger, then they can forget all those advantageous trade deals that they've got with the African nations. All those African nations are suddenly going to turn around and go, well, you lot can't get it up anymore. We want to renegotiate. What are you going to do to threaten us? We can now secure deals for ourselves with, in terms of food supply with the Russians. It will encourage trends like you've seen in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso and Guinea towards nationalist or left nationalist governments returning, maybe via military intervention from free officer movements, maybe by revolutionary movements from below involving the peasantry and the working class in the African nations. It will encourage all of that, and that is what he means by existential. It's nothing to do, they don't have any real fear of Putin rolling tanks up to Paris. That's not going to happen. What they are in terror of is that they have been exposed. The emperor is naked and is looking rather shriveled, and it is long overdue. I have said before on numerous occasions that the whole EU project, going all the way back to the immediate period after World War II, is based on, of course, fundamentally the US underpinning it. The idea of people like de Gaulle was a little bit different. De Gaulle, I think, believed that with the West German economy and with French political leadership, that they could reconstitute some version of Europe that would be strategically independent between the East and the West, between the US and the USSR. This idea was supposed to reach its fruition in the 1990s. But as I've discussed with you before, and as I've discussed in the interviews with Kit Clarenberg, the idea of EU strategic autonomy died in the Balkan Wars. It was revealed to be they were revealed to be completely impotent. They were unable to bring a negotiated settlement in Bosnia because the US just basically kept its foot on the gas and told Izetbegovic and the Bosnian leadership, don't negotiate, we've got your back. And then when they made their point to the EU that no settlement could be reached without the US giving the nod, then they forced a deal on the Bosnian leadership that was worse than the deal the EU originally wanted to give them. And it was the US using Yugoslav lives to make a point to its supposed partners in the EU, you can't do anything without us. And the last flurry of EU supposed strategic autonomy came when Chirac and Schroeder objected to the US invasion of Iraq. It wasn't a principled objection to acts of imperialism, of course. All these people had been involved in the dismembering of Yugoslavia. But it was an objection to the way that the US administration was carrying on at the time. It was an attempt to assert that strategic autonomy that de Gaulle and others had dreamed of, but turned out to be illusory. It wasn't real. It was never going to happen because how was Europe rebuilt? It was rebuilt on the lines that the US wanted it to be rebuilt after 1945. The US needed the capitalist states, the old imperialist countries of Western Europe to be reconstituted in a way that would be durable enough to see off internal revolutions, but never strong enough to challenge them. At each stage when West Germany looked to be emerging as a potential industrial competitor, the US sabotaged it. Same with Japan. The US sabotaged that via the Plaza Accords, ultimately helping to and scalped the Japanese microprocessor industry. Helping to lead, of course, to the Japanese recession, the never-ending recession after 1991, that they've never fully recovered from. And this is what was true for the West Germans and the Japanese is true for all of Europe. All of Europe was never going to be allowed to develop in such a way as to be able to break free and exist as a potential rival to US imperialism. Europe had to be shackled to US imperialism in perpetuity. And they have proven to be very successful in doing that. And they were never going to break away from US control because the US had baked their control into the original European cake. And so when the EU leaders tried to assert themselves, they found that they had no muscle mass to do so. They were flabbier than James Corden doing his karaoke bit. And this proved to be the case. And then, of course, the EU's western half was diluted further when the purely American puppet regimes in the east of Europe entered into the EU. When they entered into NATO, all that did was increase American power because these creatures that had come into power after the Soviet collapse were just pure compradors, pure agents of American imperialism. This is the reality of the EU now. And this is the last chance saloon. So in some ways, Macron is actually telling the truth when he says it's existential. He's lying to the French population as to what is at stake, because what is at stake is the fading remaining power of French imperialism is withering away in front of our eyes. This is it, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends. This is the end game. This is the final collapse of European power, which began in September of 1914, was made worse in the period 1939 to 1945, was propped up to a degree by US imperialism from 1945 to 1991. But after that, it has withered and withered and withered to the point that you see now. And when any country goes on the slide, it starts to produce figures like Schultz, like Macron, like Joe Biden, like Meloni, like Rishi Sunak, who are products of a decaying and degenerated system. Yes, the French have always had presidents who have come through elite schools, but used to be in the past, they were at least men who'd been through some kind of challenges in their lives. At least Chirac had been in the French military and had seen active service. Mitterrand was a crook and a former official of the Vichy regime, but he was a lifetime political opportunist and very shady political operator. He had real political skills. Not good skills, but he had skills. Same is true for the men that used to run the old Federal Republic of Germany. They are a hideous bunch of Nazi collaborators and reactionaries, but they had a certain talent to them. Now what do you have? Fading functionaries of delirious, decaying empire. And this is what you get on the downslope. This is when you get figures like Charles I, Louis XVI, Nicholas II, Batista in Cuba. These are the leaders that a decaying system produces. Because what has it produced in the case of the French? Somebody who is both smug, arrogant, and rather dim-witted all at the same time. Because he's trying to front up a system which is falling apart around him. And he can't correct it because the decay's gone on too long. The decay has gone on since 1914. In our case, in merry old England, or perfidious Albion if you prefer, the decay goes all the way back to the 1860s. And Britain, as the oldest capitalist country, France not far behind, developed an enormous amount of capital that's still stashed in London and in Paris. And so the decay's been a long time coming. It's been developing a long time, but it's been really there since, again, September of 1914 was the moment that really all of these regimes were fatally damaged. And they have kept themselves afloat by desperately borrowing from the US and then being propped up by the US, but also undermined by the US. But now we have reached the end. And that's what you see. You see he looks desperate and pathetic because he can't do anything. He couldn't stop them being removed from Niger. He couldn't stop them being removed from Burkina Faso or Mali, because if they tried to fight those governments, all it would do was to be immeasurably strengthen all of them, and people would turn against the French even more in their former colonial possessions. The British, of course, know this as well. That's why they subtly were happy to duck out of this and leave Macron with his dick in the wind, flapping like a naked emperor. But I'll remind you, of course, of how Putin responded to Macron's threats, which is he responded rather quickly and rather directly. Of course, he's another politician with an election to fight, so he has every reason to be out there being rather open about openly playing into the fact that the Russian population is far more angry and far more enraged at the collective West than even the Russian leadership is. But I will read to you briefly from the interview given by Putin to Dmitry Kiselev recently, just a section where he deals with Macron. Kiselev says, "Mr. President, what happened to Emmanuel Macron? Has he gone nuts? He is going to send French troops against our army. He looks like a fighting Gallic rooster and has scared all Europeans. How should one take it? In fact," says Putin, "the Western countries' military personnel have been present in Ukraine for a long time. They have been there before the coup d'etat, that's 2014, and after the coup their number has grown several times. They are involved both directly as military advisors and as foreign mercenaries, and they suffer casualties. Yet I am certain that even if foreign countries are to send their troops officially, it will not change the situation on the ground. And this is the most important thing, because arms supplies change nothing. Second, it could lead to serious geopolitical consequences if, say, Polish troops enter Ukrainian territory, allegedly for the protection, say, of the border between Belarus and Ukraine, or some other parts to release Ukrainian troops and enable them to fight along the contact line. I think Polish troops will stay there. That is what I believe. It is their heart's desire to get the lands back they have historically regarded as theirs." Then he goes on to say in the interview that any presence of European troops, be they French or Polish or whatever, inside Ukraine, that they will be considered to be invaders and that they will be considered to be legitimate targets of the Russian military. So he's been very clear, and I think that message was probably passed to Macron. It was certainly received and understood by the French military commanders. They understood very well what it meant, which is if you send your forces to sit in Odessa, Emmanuel, if you send them to sit on the Belarusian border, then you will be targeted. I mean, quite what Macron thought he was going to be able to do here. I mean, you've got to have a level of arrogance and divorce from reality to think that you can send your French army into Odessa in what, some grand military parade, and the Russians are just going to sit there. Then again, this isn't Russia of 2002. This isn't Russia of 2014. This is a Russia which has been where the population is mobilized and wanting to fight against the West and remove Western influence from Ukraine and take back a lot of lands in Ukraine. And that the public opinion in Russia is running quite significantly ahead of Putin in terms of the level of hostility they have towards the NATO bloc. So if he thinks that there's going to be some kind of weakness or wavering on Putin's part, all of the major political forces in Russia are gathered around a consensus now upon this point, that the war must be fought to its conclusion and there must be no shrinking from confrontation with anybody who goes in there. And the French can't sustain a deployment there. Macron admitted that himself in the interview, that they don't have the necessary ammunition to supply Ukraine with, which means also they don't have the necessary ammunition to supply their own forces with. Even if you assume that they are keeping some reserves back in France and Germany and Britain for usage of their own forces, according to a British general, the British Air Force would run out of ammunition in a week. And what total forces could they get to go and fight the Russians? No more than, say, what, 50-odd thousand, 60-odd thousand? The Russians have at least 500,000 men. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? What happens if they send this expeditionary force in the manner that Macron was apparently imagining in there, and the Russians just blow it all up? What were they going to do? Soil themselves and ask Daddy Biden to come in and bail them out? Well, the American imperialists are as cowardly and cynical as the French are. They're just slightly bigger. They had no interest in an actual direct shooting war with the Russians. They were hoping that their outsourced army would do it for them. And they've certainly no interest in bailing out little Emmanuel if he goes and gets himself in a war with the Russians. American politicians have no interest in that. Biden doesn't. Trump certainly doesn't. So again, how was this going to work? It wasn't. The whole thing was predicated upon the still complete falsehood, the complete nonsensical myth that they got into their heads, that the mere sight of the glittering armies of Europe marching into Ukraine would be enough to scare off the Russians. It will not. It will not. They know very well who was responsible for their miserable the time that was inflicted upon the Russian working class in the 90s and in the 2000s. They know it was the domestic compradors who have finally been pushed into political irrelevance, but they also know that it was the imperialists actively trying to loot and destroy their country. They know that very well. And so why on earth would the Russian population be intimidated by you, Emmanuel? It was never going to happen, was it? They would probably welcome the chance to devour your armies, much as the armies of Napoleon were devoured in 1812, much as the Hitlerites were devoured in 41 to 45. This was a complete miscalculation, but it is the end. And now Macron has revealed himself before his domestic political opponents and before his domestic audience as being a man who's, to use an American phrase, all hat and no cattle, or to use a British phrase from Northern England, all fur coat and no knickers. His weakness, the weakness of his position will only increase. The weaknesses of French imperialism have been exposed more and more and more. I will emphasize again, this is the end. The end began a long time ago. It began before all of us on this stream were even born, before even most of our grandparents were born, perhaps. But the end has been coming a long time. Remember this. It's a different era, but it's worth remembering that it took a long time for the Western Roman Empire to actually fall apart. It took centuries for the Byzantine Empire to finally get rolled over by the Ottoman Turks. It took a long time for the horrific weaknesses in the French absolutist regime to manifest itself fully. And now we're seeing all the weaknesses manifest themselves in this these Western European states that have been propped up for 100 years by American imperialism and by extraction of wealth from their colonies and neo-colonies. And this is all ending now. And so we will see in the near future a massive intensification in the domestic class struggle in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Italy. And this is why, of course, all of these countries are desperately beefing up their repressive apparatus, hoping that they, via means of censorship and state terror and arrests and detention, that they can somehow stave off the internal revolt. But the internal revolt is coming, and you can hear it in the distance, if you listen carefully, like a drum beat before it reaches a crescendo. And Emmanuel Macron can hear the beat of the drums distantly in his ears. Right, here we go. I will just flip back to the chat now because there's a lot of contributions coming in. Right. Right. Bear with me a second. I'm scrolling up and up and up to try and find where we left it. Right. Okay. So, Banana Bender says, cyber attack is a baseless conspiracy driven by the French right and accepted by the libtards. I'll have to look into that further. I don't know enough about it. That's why I asked the question. Mr. Chopin says, every accusation that the Western imperialists make against the so-called terrorists like Hamas and the Russian Federation is a confession. Always has been. Mr. Chopin is right there. Lertis says there's always been Russian-based groups engaged in hacking. What Macron is complaining about that there's no legal cooperation anymore on a state level. Well, you declare that you're going to war with somebody, they tend to stop cooperating with you. Though, of course, we're not at war with Russia, but Russia must be defeated. We're not at war with Russia, but we are. What is it again? Steve Choate says, double military spending. There goes healthcare. Can sign up for American-style healthcare, pay or die. Well, that's the future they have in mind for us. It's up to us to stop that. Red Star Betty says, the NED, USAID, CIA roadshow. Yeah. Lertis says, some odd interpretation there. And our contributor here has some knowledge of French. The translation is softening some of Macron's words. Interesting. Interesting. Do we have an alternative translation we could possibly look at? I won't inflict a replay of that on you. He's even worse than Sunak. I mean, so maybe it's because it's in a language that I can read far better than I can speak. But interesting that he's softened there. Thomas says, I hope Macron can back up his threats. Turns out he can't. Nikolov says, public schoolboy talking tough. Yeah. Every man should lose a fight in his early years, if only to experience a humbling. Because if you're not experienced in actually losing a fight, in having some, shall we say, humility, literally beaten into you sometimes, you can grow up to be like Emmanuel Macron. Losing a fight can work to your advantage if you know how to apply the lessons. Chicken Pot Pie says the Empire of Lies. Very true. GCCX Pro says EU is a USA post-war project. All these clowns are just puppets. These days, it's looking that way, yes. I mean, I think I should probably do something on the EU and its history separately to this, because there's a lot to discuss there that I can't go into tonight. Thomas says, now that France is losing its colonies, how can it hope to sustain arming Ukraine? It can't, and Macron, I think, on some level knows that. Nikolov says, not so much France, but all the rest. Steve says, talk is cheap, send the military in or let him eat cake. Well, he might not even have any cake to eat by the end of it. De Gaulle was the last. Well, he was the last French bourgeois leader who has really had a clear vision. It was a vision he could never retain, though. Greetings to Fenrir. And Lerty says, at the very most, it is conceivable that Russia could protect Transnistria. Well, they'd have difficulty at the moment. I mean, not without. I mean, to protect Transnistria, they'd need to land in Odessa. But are the Moldovans going to commit suicide on behalf of NATO? Well, it's possible. I mean, Sandu certainly seems determined to follow Zelensky. But could they flatten Transnistria? I mean, Transnistria has armed forces. There are Russian forces there. I mean, I doubt that the French would get themselves involved directly in a Moldovan attack or a Ukrainian attack on Transnistria. But it would be a nasty little fight, or a nasty big fight in actual fact. There's no guarantee that the Moldovan armed forces would win. And if they get the Romanians to do it, well, again, that's Romanians in a direct fight with the Russians. Did the Bucharest government really have the stomach for that? Some of the compradors might be up for it, but is the Romanian population up for it? I doubt it. What we've learned really is that these comprador regimes that have existed in Europe and Eastern Europe since the people's democracies collapsed is that a lot of them exist on a very shaky, shallow basis. There's not a lot of support there. Remember Mao's old paper tiger comment? Well, I doubt that the Romanian bourgeois even qualifies as a tiger. Maybe a paper field mouse. French economy is already destroyed in response to Thomas's comment, who says Macron destroys the French economy just to do the bidding of the US. Most of these European economies have been zombies for a long time. France included, Germany included, Britain definitely included, Italy included too. Gracie Knoll observes that Macron looks desperate. Very true. Gracie Knoll also says the neoliberal financialized Western countries are revealed as hollowed out paper tigers. Yeah, and there's not a lot that they can do now. Not without fundamentally changing the way the economy works, and of course launching enormous attacks on the working class, which they will try and do. And it will generate, of course, only more opposition. And the political regimes are so hollowed out, they might find themselves needing to revert to fascism quite quickly. Who will replace Macron? Interesting question from Thomas. Probably maybe Le Pen, or maybe Le Pen's party, if they find perhaps they would try and float like a candidate that will be the candidate of Le Pen's party but won't be Le Pen herself. Maybe they'll go for that. But certainly, I mean, it's said by many observers who know more about French politics than I do that Macron's been adopting like bits of Le Pen's agenda for years now. So again, like he's already moved the country in the direction of the very fascism that elements of the French left will tell you that you had to vote for Macron to stop. So it's certainly set up for a Le Pen or a candidate that isn't Le Pen but is controlled by her party to win the next one. But again, Le Pen's also been moving towards Macron, I think, in recent years. Like she's dropped more of the economic interventionist stuff that she had in her manifesto. Not this election just gone, but the first one she ran in. So we'll see. Certainly, she's been making herself more amenable to the French bourgeoisie, I think. JJ, glad you could stomach with my watching the interview with my director's commentary. Fenrir says, sadly, it will take 5 more years to the French to figure out that Le Pen does the same as Macron. Well, they serve the same master. They're both bourgeois politicians. Same as Meloni in Italy. I see a lot of these like dissident right guys saying, "Oh, Meloni's this sort of anti-NATO sovereignist type." No, none of that. She was never any of that. Even on the supposed big anti-immigration politics, she's come out because she's a pure servant of the Italian bourgeois and says we need more immigration for the cheap labour. If nothing else, she told the truth on that. Ash observes that Macron is harder to watch than Sunak. Very true. Lertis says the EU is a zombie since the French and Dutch referendum defeats. Yeah, I think it's been dead for at least 14, 15 years. I mean, if it was never going to work, unifying all of these nations inside, even if they managed to make the economic integration more extensive, this was never going to work on a capitalist basis. The various ruling classes in France and Germany, of course, were basically wanting to treat the southern and eastern European countries as essentially colonies and asset strip them. And that was always going to cause trouble. And there was always going to be national rivalries between the different bourgeoisies in the West. You bolt on NATO to that, and you've got a whole other set of contradictions and problems. So the EU is preserved by inertia, bureaucratic inertia, and of course the fear within the ruling class of Germany and France that if it goes down, then they're really screwed. Without the EU enables them to project their power on a higher level than they would be able to otherwise. Without the EU, the EU exploding or imploding will severely damage the capitalist classes in Germany and France. They are desperate to avoid that. The vampire ball is over. Yes, a very good phrase of Putin's. Comrade Hello Hi asks, what are your thoughts on Russian monarchist nationalism? Do they have any power in Russia? Apparently they've got some influence inside the Putin circle. You could tell that when Putin makes disparaging references to the Bolsheviks, despite the fact that his entire success as a leader in terms of industry and reindustrialization is based on the Soviet legacy. So they have some influence. Enthusiasm for the return of the Tsardom, I don't see a lot of that. There's a lot more enthusiasm for a return of the Soviet Union than there was of the Tsar. Now, my thoughts on Russian monarchist nationalism as a thing, a desperate and degenerate creed that should be cast out and exposed for what it is, which is like an attempt to do what? Recreate the glorious days of Nicholas II, an empire that exploded, was crushed under the weight of its own contradictions, that couldn't contain the developing Russian bourgeois and the explosive national question that it had posed by its occupation of these different areas and the repression of the populations and native languages and cultures. Russian national chauvinism and monarchism is a disgusting reactionary trend, and it is a minority position amongst Russians, I think, a very small minority position. Just as Russian fascism was a very small minority position, and most of them have fucked off to Ukraine now and are being used as mercenaries to attack the country of their birth. Good evening to Jenny, who's joined us. And we're just scrolling down here. The question is, which of the European countries will first try to ally themselves with Russia? Asks Baskia9. Well, later on in the interview, I didn't have this on there, but Macron complained that Fico of Slovakia was pro-Russian. So possibly, I mean, there's rumbles in the East consistently from minority parties and opposition parties of sort of an attempt to recreate some sort of sovereignist movement in the East. It still seems to be confused and often anti-communist, but you got figures like Orban. Fico came from the old Czechoslovak Communist Party, I think. So those figures do exist. So when the whole thing implodes, you'll see Hungary be better positioned than most to do deals with the Russians, at least. Maybe Slovakia. I mean, maybe even Poland. Admittedly, the Polish reactionaries haven't exactly been friendly towards the Russians in recent years, but there's every reason to suspect that they may flip the script if the EU goes down. Such a sad life to be a cuck, observes Jenny regarding Macron. Trudeau, the coiffured hair of fascism, says Red Star Bessie. The empty head of liberalism, I would say. Martin asks, can you comment on de Gaulle's redemption of dollars for gold, which resulted in the end of the gold standard in the US? I have a shaky understanding of the international monetary economics, but it is important. Well, that was what apparently prompted, I think it was Nixon, to throw a fit and decide that they needed to essentially dump the gold standard because the US had already burnt through a lot of its gold reserves financing its debts. And so when the allies, their supposed allies, started saying, well, we want our gold back, basically, I think that part of the answer was, well, we don't really have it anymore. So the preservation of the gold standard, I think, relied upon the idea that the US was a safe place to keep your gold. When it was revealed that it wasn't a particularly safe place to keep your gold, they needed to do something else. And that something else was, of course, ending the gold standard and moving to fiat currency. To credit where credit is due, Hudson has a good account of this in the Super Imperialism book. I mean, the history of it. I disagree with his thesis, but in terms of a good history of the end of the gold standard, that's the section of that book to read. Then they moved over to this the dollar as the global reserve currency, which is basically like you get to export your inflation then. You get to export your economic problems because you have underpinned the dollar's strength by having it used via the deal with the Saudis to in all international oil purchases. And of course, that encourages the usage of it in various other methods of international account settling. Then because it becomes the global reserve currency, it then becomes your problem if the US has an inflation crisis. So eventually, though, this is going to fall apart. This was, again, papering over the cracks caused by the failure of the US gold standard system. And now this is going to become apart because of the same problem, which is the US created this system and then weaponized it against everybody. You all have to use dollars to settle international payments, and you all have to use international payment systems that we either control or have a backdoor into, like SWIFT. So we'll stop you using dollars, and we'll stop you using our banking system, and we'll stop you using the international payment system that we control. So what do? Well, you close off one avenue. Human ingenuity will find ways around it. And in the ingenuity of the French and the Russians and the Chinese found a way around the blockages that the US imperialists had attempted to put on their usage of the dollar and the Russian usage of the international payment system and the international banking system. They created ways around it. It forced them to innovate in a way that they wouldn't have been forced to if the US hadn't used it that way. But then again, the US had no choice if it wanted to preserve its hegemonic status but to weaponize the very things that had given it this strength in the first place. You see what I mean about imperialism digging its own grave? It can't help but dig its own grave. Right. Potted Rodent asks, is the state of the left in France about the same as the US and Britain? Arguably stronger in some respects, but suffers from all the same problems, which is that it's dominated by social democratic tendencies. It's dominated by the politics of the labor aristocracy. There are things like the pole of communist renewal in France, which are quite interesting. They're actually doing work on rebuilding the communist movement there. So some of the right things are being done, but just as in Britain or in the US, this is small time stuff. At the moment, we're building foundations right now. Same stuff is going on in France. He wants to go and volunteer to the meat grinder. That would be nobody, in response to Thomas's question. I have read Perry Anderson's book about the EU. What is your opinion? I haven't read it, so I can't tell you. I wonder what a woman's version of losing a fight would be, asks Ash. That's a good question. I think it's a very good question, actually. I think for men, of course, I mean, speaking from my own experience, you're expected to have brawls at school. You're expected to win and lose fights. And in the end, like if you learn the right lessons from it, it does you an enormous favor. I mean, in terms of the woman's version of that, I'm not sure. But I was making the comparison to Macron because it tends to be public school educated men who end up in these positions of power rather than the privately educated women who do. But again, like what would be the humbling experience with regard to a woman's early development? It's an interesting question. I hadn't considered it, to be honest. The bourgeois successor to Macron will probably be Philippe. Or is he from Macron's group, or is he from Le Pen's group? Putin's shirt says, seems like after the dissolution of the USSR, all of Eastern Europe fell into economic stagnation without all the Soviet investments. I would say it's not just that. It's that the economic, or more specifically, the industrial base of Eastern Europe was actively destroyed by the comprador class in the service of US and German imperialism. They didn't want these industries to survive. They asset stripped and destroyed the industries of, for instance, Eastern Germany. They did the same with Poland and Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia, and they broke up Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. Same in former Yugoslavia. All of these industries had to be destroyed because they had to essentially be able to use Eastern European labor to work cheaply in German or US or French or Italian-owned industries, or use them as cheap labor inside the imperial core. So it wasn't just that there was no Soviet investment, it was that the imperialists sought to annihilate all that socialist that built up industrial base in those countries. Like what still exists in Poland of an industrial base is all based on the People's Democracy period. But in a lot of other countries, it just got annihilated. I mean, look at how NATO relentlessly bombed the industrial base of Serbia in the 1999 bombing campaign. It wasn't just the fact that they wanted to cripple the Serb economy. It was that they actively wanted to destroy the remnants of socialism. Because again, the Eastern Europeans' fate was to be reduced to the status of cheap laborers for the imperialist countries. Big Meanie says, just being a woman in patriarchal society is the equivalent of being beaten in a fight. Interesting. Good point, to be honest. Edouard Philippe says, Lurtis, in explanation to my question, was the first Prime Minister of Macron has been building his power base ever since. Okay, so it's probably going to be a Macron clone, basically, just as ineffectual. Okay, so we are now hitting the midnight hour. We are past the midnight hour. So I'm going to draw this one to a close. I hope you have enjoyed our walk through the Mind Palace of Emmanuel Macron. I will be back again tomorrow with the special edition of the program, because we're going to be looking at the results of the National People's Congress in China and looking at the reports and the results that have come out of that, and the Chinese legislative process as well. So I hope you can join me for that one. Until then, though, I will leave you with some customary music.
до самых окраин, южных гор до северных морей. Человек проходит как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, а заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не затрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.